and welcome to the programme, storing people's names on an anti-terror database. And this is the important bit, without their knowledge, even if they've done nothing wrong. A key UK anti-terror strategy is in the spotlight, and what we want to know is how far should governments go to keep us safe? Welcome to Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. It is called Prevent, a UK government programme supposedly there to help spot people at risk of being radicalised at an early stage. But like other anti-terror measures across Europe and beyond, it's under fire for apparently breaching people's civil liberties.
People working all across the UK public sector are required to contribute to anti-terrorism strategy, from teachers to medical staff to local government workers. Public servants are asked to report signs of possible extremism. This student at Sussex University found himself being questioned by counter-terror police officers under the Prevent policy.
Two guys in plain clothes, they showed me their badges, and they were like, we just found some things on your Facebook, you follow a few speakers who are questionable. I responded by saying that I don't really think those speakers are that problematic, and me following them does not mean that I'm agreeing with everything that they say.
He was head of the Islamic Society at the time and engaged in student activism. He believes he was targeted due to his faith.
I started questioning everything that I did. I started questioning whether I can be as politically active as I am, questioning if I can't practice my faith. And that is, for me, that is one of my most fundamental rights.
Earlier this month, human rights group Liberty uncovered a secret government database of people reported to Prevent. Campaigners say it's being used to monitor and control communities. After years of concern about the Prevent strategy, an independent review was announced earlier this year. The Security Minister Ben Wallace challenged critics to produce solid evidence of their allegations, accusing them of distortion and spin.
When Prevent was launched in 2003, the government said it was to support vulnerable people who had been radicalised. In 2015, schools, health workers and other local authorities were given a legal duty to report concerns about people they believed to be at risk. But it has been widely criticised for targeting certain communities and creating more distrust. Instead of reform, many campaigners believe Prevent should be scrapped.
Home Office figures reveal that referrals to Prevent in 2017 was 6,093 and increased to 7,318 in 2018.
I think counterterrorism measures on Prevent on a whole are insidious. They inhibit people's freedom of speech. They curtail our civil liberties.
Prevent does have its supporters, including influential voices within counter-terrorism. But in the pull between security and civil liberties, where should we draw the line?
Well, with me, I'm very pleased to say we have Rizwaan Sabir, criminology lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, who was himself arrested and referred to Prevent. We have the security analyst Edward Marsh, who's looked into how Prevent is or isn't working. Vajahat Shareef, we welcome here, head of terrorism and national security at Tucker's Solicitors, who's been involved in a lot of anti-terror cases. And on the line from Florence, Richard McNeil-Wilson from the European University Institute, who studies the different approaches to counter-terrorism across the continent. That was a very long introduction. But gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Rizwaan, I guess your name is somewhere there on this database.
Probably on a lot more databases than just one that's come late in the most recent coverage, because I've got access to those databases, which include the Police National Computer, which holds information on any individual who's been arrested and detained, irrespective of whether they've been released without charge for a period of 99 years.
Did you look for your name on that?
I won a civil litigation case against Nottinghamshire Police for false arrest. In an out-of-court settlement, £20,000 damages was paid to me. And as part of that legal case, we were given access to a plethora of documents and files, which included classified police intelligence entries maintained on myself, which included my involvement in peaceful protest.
Did you get it wiped?
Not all of it. Some of them, under the Data Protection Act, were wiped because they contained incorrect intelligence entries, such as, for example, that I was a convicted terrorist when that was just not true.
Okay, Edward, I mean, look, you've looked into whether it is or isn't working. Since 2015, it's been around for, 15 years now, but since 2015, it's become a little bit more controversial because of the way people are referred by teachers, by nurses, by anybody in the public domain who could think that there's something a bit fishy about them here. Does this database not now add to those suspicions?
Well, it certainly adds another layer of a problematic layer to the entire story of Prevent. In its conception, it was a good way to initially consider how we steer people away from terrorism. I think a lot of the reasons Prevent has steered off course and caused issue in society, particularly amongst those who are there to implement it, initially was a really quite staggering misunderstanding, almost a marketing problem about the entire strategy itself. But
Sorry to interrupt. May I just sort of encapsulate the ethos of it as it was originally set out? The idea being to talk to people, perhaps before they were further radicalised, because the suggestion at the beginning would be that they've been exposed to something.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But I think over time, and with the initially, I remember going into schools very early on. I remember talking to people about who does your Prevent training, and we get a third party in. It was a bit of kind of a Wild West. Anyone could go in and give this training to schools and teachers, and it really left itself in a melee of confusion. And teachers, when you start hearing teachers use language along the lines of "we're spying on our children," you know it's gone wrong in its concept to its implementation.
This is what I don't understand. Maybe I'm being naive. It was done with the best intentions to stop people being radicalised, to prevent them going off in the wrong direction.
Yes.
Where do you think it's gone wrong? Because it is hugely unpopular.
The problem has been in the implementation and the reporting, the quality of the individuals who are being asked to give the information. This is not their job. They're effectively co-opted into something they don't want to do. So let's say an individual in normal interaction with, let's say, social worker, for example, is then analysed to see whether they constitute a problem. They have an ideological issue. They're an Islamist extremist or a right-wing extremist. The social worker is primarily there to deal with family welfare issues. They're not trained to look at these subtle issues, sophisticated and complex.
And some of them, it's almost laughable, isn't it? I mean, there was this 10-year-old boy who wrote about living in a terrorist house.
That's a classic example.
And it turned out that he was talking about a terraced house, which, for those that don't know, who don't live in England, is a row of houses together in a terrace. It's bizarre, isn't it, that people were able to get to these particular levels where they're reporting things, and they don't seem to have much idea.
I'm just quickly going to make a point that that's the initial layer of reporting. It's then passed on to more experienced practitioners, you could call them, who are counter-terrorism officers who have more experience in dealing with extremist ideology. And often, although there may be a case where a person's name remains on the record, they're not pursued.
Richard, it almost sounds a little bit like, look, it's not funny, but it sounds almost comical in some of its, the way it's been put together. Is it the same everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we've seen taking place throughout Europe, throughout the EU, is a lot of copying of this approach by the UK, because the UK has been able to market itself as being a leader in counter-terrorism and counter-extremism as counter-extremism develops. What we have now developing throughout the EU is sort of these lots of different approaches towards terrorism, and particularly towards extremism, as this paradigm, this discussion on extremism comes out, which has happened since the sort of 2015 Prevent duty has come in. And we're talking about a term that's legally very difficult to define. Sort of definitions have been bogged down in quagmires as people have different views on what extremism is and isn't. It's very much dependent on a number of different factors on what form of government is in charge. And this is seen throughout Europe as Europe is trying to negotiate discussions on extremism and coming up with these kind of very broad, open concepts that ultimately end up in this dragnet approach.
Can I just say to you, Richard, and we can broaden it out now here, a gentleman called Lord Carlisle, yeah, and we'll debate whether he's the right person or not in just a moment, has been given the job of taking a look at Prevent and working out what needs to change. What do you think needs to change?
Prevent, I mean, personally, I think there's huge structural problems in Prevent in the way that it's designed. We've talked about sort of the melee of confusion that's coming from the Prevent duty. So there's concerns over how extremism is understood and how concepts of extremism are being used in and through Prevent. There's an awful lot of confusion also within Prevent itself, within individuals who are trained within the Prevent structure. And actually, as part of my research, formally as part of the PhD, I've spoken to a lot of Prevent practitioners, a lot of Prevent policymakers, and a lot of them have very different ideas of what Prevent is and isn't. And the way that then that is articulated through Prevent delivery, and then now through this extra layer of universities, of prisons, of social care that now also have to involve themselves in Prevent, is that they're producing wildly different conceptualizations of what it is and responding to it very differently.
So nobody really understands it, and hopefully this would be what this eminent man called Lord Carlisle will do. He'll sort it out, he'll make it better, and it'll work. Rizwaan.
I think the whole concept of a review is a way of kind of giving a carrot to the critics of Prevent, who have very strongly criticized this policy ever since its inception in 2006, and especially its kind of institutionalization in 2011 and 15. It's a way of kind of giving them a carrot to say, look, we're taking your critique and your discussion seriously, and we are going to review it. Well, if they were taking the critique seriously, then they would listen to what a lot of the critics have said, and that is that this policy, which seeks to police the preemptive space, i.e. to stop individuals using very legal and very ordinary behaviors, like a change in dress sense, for example, or the closing off, or the kind of detailing of altruism or giving charity, using these kind of indicators to assess who is a future threat, criminalizes, of course, these innocent behaviors. But I think more importantly, what it does...
But that's what a review for. What makes you think a review won't tackle this?
So the critics are saying that this exclusion, based on these indicators, is causing radicalisation. So what we need is to remove this policy called the Prevent strategy, or countering violent extremism across the globe, because it's having the very opposite effect.
Okay, so maybe Lord Carlisle will come up with a plan that says, I'm going to do exactly what Rizwaan says there. I'm going to take that element out of it. I'm going to reshape it in a way that you agree with as an expert in criminology. But it's the man himself who's also being criticised, because he said of Prevent, I have considered and strong support for it.
Well, the main problem with Prevent is that there's no legal definition of an extremism. There is no legal definition of it. Instead, there's what's described as individuals having a particular quality, holding British values, respect for the rule of law, respect for equality, respect for same-sex relationships, etc. And if you don't hold these values, you enter into the arena of being analysed and approached to see whether you are a British citizen, what kind of values you do hold.
Does that mean that there's no way this can be corrected?
I think Parliament has been abdicating its responsibility for a long time, been skirting around the issue. It really has to focus and salvage this policy by giving a proper, sound, legal definition. So us lawyers...
Before you come in, and I know you've been dying to say something for a few minutes, is there anybody who thinks it is wrong the premise of prevent is actually quite useful. Believe it is good to prevent somebody from being radicalised.
Well, it's not even to prevent people from being radicalised. I think this is a misconception. I think the entire policy, you said earlier in the show that it was kind of created with this benign objective of stopping radicalisation. Actually, I think if you look at the policy, it's clearly about controlling populations and communities from expressing resistance in a way that the government feels threatened by. And I think this is a very important point for the discussion to recognise that it might be shrouded in this policy lexicon and language around trying to stop radicalisation, when actually nobody even knows what radicalisation is.
But I think we've hit on the point, everyone. It is the ambiguity of language from 2003 with the war.
Which is when it started.
With the war on terror, which was the most ludicrous term to put out there from Bush and Blair, which left confusion for civil security, which created complete ambiguity for military personnel on the ground. What is a strategic war on terrorism? God only knows, and they're still trying to work it out through Iraq and Afghanistan and Tora Bora, all of it. And right down to prevent, we're seeing the same ambiguity in language. We don't have necessarily the legal framework. We have misconceptions, or arguably misconceptions on, is it control, is it prevention, right down to the teachers. And I think you said yourself, they don't want to do this. And I think you'll find teachers don't necessarily want to do it because they're scared, because they don't really understand it. They don't understand the language that's been used. They don't understand the remits that they're looking at. But I mean, teachers themselves have a safeguarding obligation, and where does safeguarding end?
When you went in and started looking at all of this and you were asked for your advice, how was it received?
I think initially they were extremely keen to. The glaring problem was the wide nature in people who were delivering the prevent training, the misconceptions people had just within the school. You'd have 2 prevent staff who had different ideas. It's an incredible melee of language and misunderstanding.
Okay, but you suggested some changes. Was anybody prepared to listen?
Yeah, I think there are now certainly trusts, entire school trusts, who have fixed training from the police and local communities, which is a much, much better way to do it than having individuals who often used to go through one level of training, a few training days a year, and then go and provide prevent training. It was a ludicrous format.
Neil Basu, head of the National Counter-Terror Police Network, reckons that since the Westminster and the London Bridge attacks, the number of attacks, 422, 7 of them relating to suspected far-right terror.
And you know, just to add to the point you've made, MI5 have now taken on a key responsibility in investigating far-right violence as well. So it's a very positive thing that the state is actually taking white supremacy and white supremacist violence seriously. Muslims and other communities, racialized communities, have been saying these kinds of things for a very, very long time. But I think it's still important to recognize that this whole discussion around shared British values, this sense of patriotism and nationalism that is intrinsic to the prevent and counter-extremism arena, is one that ultimately constructs the Western way of being as superior, and therefore tries to implement itself as a way of increasing Western power throughout the world. And it does that through tools such as international law. So under the UN, under a UN resolution, the number I cannot remember off the top of my head, it's now a legal duty on all nation states to implement prevent and CVE policies.
You think it is systemic, that no amount of tweaking is going to change it? But I'll go back to Neil Basu, this head of the National Counter-Terror Police Network, who says lots of people criticise it. I won't go into all of the words he used, but I won't give ground to critics whose agenda is to discredit prevent. No one who has challenged prevent to date has had a better idea. And what I'm hearing, Richard, I'll put this one to you, what I'm hearing here is that, yes, it doesn't work. Yes, different people have different views as to what the agenda is, but who's got a better idea to keep us safe?
In some places, for instance, in Scandinavian countries, in Denmark, we see approaches which are much more focused on actually just building up the support that is provided within schools, within social services, and actually trying to remove a lot of the security focus that the UK is trying to push into schools, into public institutions. So actually, there are lots of different ways of approaching this that aren't being done.
Can anybody give me? I mean, we've looked at some of the Scandinavian models, but one thing in particular.
A friend of mine does de-radicalisation work from an ideological Islamic perspective, and he's very successful. He has worked, I think he may still work for the Home Office, but anything that is not ideology-based has been unsuccessful. The alternative is a scientific, psychological assessment that's been less successful and less effective. But can I quickly make the point about my opinion of PREVENT? I've always thought PREVENT as an extension of Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, which I can go into more detail if you want, in the civil sphere, whereby it's an intelligence gathering tool primarily, and there are also subordinate purposes and objectives of dealing with people who have questionable ideology.
Yeah, so no surprise that there is a database out there.
Of course not, because there's always been a database.
Yeah, so
security services keep a database.
This furore about it was all to do with getting PREVENT itself back into the headlines, correct?
In my view, it's nonsense, because security services, before the PREVENT policy was in place, have always had security services, special branch, and their offshoots have always had this contact with universities, with that community level, of having access to individuals who are suspicious or are of concern.
So they know who's out there, but some of these people who are out there are like this guy who already lived in a terrorist house when it was a terrorist house.
Right, David, you made an important point about this database existing. Everyone's kind of known that this database and this information is contained, but I think it's harsh to say it's nonsense. And I think in a democratic, accountable, free society, I think one of the key things that makes it those things is the element of transparency. So if you have been referred to the state for whatever reason, your ideas, your views, you said eco-terrorism in class, whatever it may be, as a citizen of this country, you should have the ability and the spaces to access that information in order to know what the state holds on you, in order to bring accountability and to ensure transparency. But with this database, the element of secrecy around it has been so strong because a lot of the information contained on these files and documents will most likely relate to very ordinary kind of mundane behavior, ideas, viewpoints that have been shared. And I know this from the legal case that I fought and successfully completed, was the kind of information that's stored on these intelligence systems is something as bizarre as this individual turned up at a student demonstration on campus.
But can I just put the counter to that, which is that if something terrible happens, if there is an attack, then the police and the security services are criticised, in many ways quite rightly, for not having kept tabs on people.
No, the security services, according to their own estimates, are monitoring 20 to 23,000 so-called suspects or people of interest. So I think what's happened is the pressure around trying to nip terrorism in the bud early, preemptively, means that everybody becomes a suspect potentially, and therefore everybody has to be on some database. So what you do is you create more work for yourself, and it becomes unworkable.
But damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, and I think whenever we saw the London Bridge attacks, and the first, within a couple of hours, there was the connection to Anjum Chowdhury, and it was a security service failing. So I think the security services are damned if they do and damned if they don't. I think the public and the media, we push it down their throats. You knew about this guy, what happened? It's fascinating that one of the pillars of democracy is freedom of speech and that transparency we all want and cherish. But actually one of the other pillars is our security and our defence. And these pillars kind of collide in this one area quite significantly. So we want security, but at the same time, we want complete transparency.
Can I have Vajahat before we go? And we don't have very much time.
Yes.
You've defended people or represented people in a lot of terror-related cases.
Yes.
Have any of those come to you via PREVENT and been found to be guilty as charged?
Yes. I have to concede that point, yes. But I think from a wider social democratic perspective, it would assist if individuals were aware from a perspective of transparency, but also if they understood the assessments of their behaviour that the security services and counter-terrorism command officers make, then they would understand the line between
But I can see the conundrum
acceptable
here.
and unacceptable.
This is
behaviour.
somebody who was caught doing something that was illegal. If they were then told how they'd been caught and the reasons why they were caught, then it would be out in the public domain, and the next person emulating them might not be.
I apologise for generalising, but
That's exactly what I'm doing.
I'm
No
going to
apologies
I'm
needed.
going to generalise and say a lot of the individuals who've been arrested and charged with terrorism offences are very young, very immature, very inexperienced. They certainly could do with a lot more help and guidance in sorting out their particular viewpoints in life, and inevitably,
I wish we had more time. I really do.
inevitably, years down the
me
line,
too.
they become completely
really
different
wish we
people.
had. I really wish we had more time. And Richard, we're going to have to take your nodding as an agreement with what we were hearing just here. We don't have any more time, at least at this table, to talk about it. Thank you so much for coming in. It is a difficult one, isn't it? But perhaps 2020, I think it is, when Lord Carlisle starts his review, which is only a couple of months away from now, to hear what confidence, perhaps in 6-9 months, you have in what he's looking at. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster, we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.